First of all, my son was born there, and the week that he was born there were 7 little boys born there, and the nursery was all little boys. And several of those boys still live here in Boulder City. Yes, I was going to speak to you about this part of the hospital, this lower area. And for a while, during World War II, it was turned into the National Park Service. The National Park Service building was turned into a school, or I think it was 4th and 5th grade that went to school in the National Park Service building that was downtown. It was where the Legion Hall had been. Yeah.
In the museum, when it was the Park Service, they had the sloth that they had found in, I think it was on the Indian reservation north of Las Vegas. And also, they had for a while the mummified body of Kehoe, the Indian Kehoe that had outlaw, and they had found him. But at that time, they didn't have the facilities in Moapa that they have now. So it was here.
Boulder City raised the money to reopen the hospital. And they just, everybody in the community just gave what they could, and we reopened the hospital. Mr. Connolly was the chief accountant for the Bureau of Reclamation project. That's the Boulder Dam project. And his wife saw that building sitting up there, and she just got the whole community together, and we raised the money to reopen, and she administered the hospital during World War II.
I'm Patty Jacobson. My husband and I have lived here for 42 years. We raised our children across the street from the old hospital. My mother worked in the hospital in the front office doing insurance before the hospital moved down the hill. After she retired, she and my father had a landscaping company. And when the sisters owned the convent, Mom and Dad put in all the green landscape and all the beautiful green trees, including planting a lot of them, like that little palm tree that went bye-bye. During 4th of July in the old days, before 4th of July moved down to Veterans Park, actually before there was a Veterans Park, they used to shoot the fireworks off at the football stadium at the high school. And the whole neighborhood would go lie up there on the grass, usually wrapped up because it was cool, lie on their backs and watch the fireworks as it exploded up in the sky. The sisters were dream neighbors. They were lovely ladies. They were an Anglican order from Bristol, England, and they were the best neighbors in the best parts of the community you could possibly have. But then, of course, after they sold it, everything went downhill. And no, the hospital is not haunted. I've lived here for 42 years. Believe me, I know.
City has a lot of buildings that are very important for various reasons, historical buildings, but one of the most important that everybody has a connection to, had a connection to, was the old Six Companies Hospital up on the hill on the east side of town. How many dam workers did it house who were injured? How many people recovered there or died there during the flu epidemic of 1933 or the meningitis epidemics of 1932? I mean, every family has a story that has to do with it. I mean, it really was operating for a short time. It opened when? November 15th, 1931, specifically to house the dam workers and sometimes their families. And it was always this enormous presence on that end of town. It just was such an anchor. When the dam was finished, that hospital was closed down, and then the Park Service took it over. I don't know if anybody remembers this or knows this, that it was the first legitimate museum in Boulder City. It was the Civilian Conservation Corps boys in 1938 that worked for the Park Service that went in and remodeled it and set up displays of the construction of Hoover Dam and the filling of Lake Mead. And that became a great tourist attraction for Boulder City. And people came from miles around. If they were coming to see the dam and the lake rising, they stopped at the museum up there. And those Civilian Conservation Corps boys, when they were doing the work, on the basement walls and on the piers underneath, they wrote their names and the dates that they were down there working. And those survived. And they were revealed when some work was being done in the 1980s. And it was amazing that that little bit of history that was so important survived in that hospital all those years. And gone now, of course. And that was a tremendous loss because the Civilian Conservation Corps was so important here. And they were boys, just young men far away from home, working for a few bucks to send home to their families. And there, they wrote their names, they'd recorded, they'd looked that far ahead, and that had been saved, and now it's gone. And it got shut down again in the early 1940s, but the government opened the hospital again in 1943 to house men who had been injured in the war. They came to Boulder City from all over the country, all over the theaters, the East Theater, Europe, Japan, where they'd been injured. They came to Boulder City to recuperate. And what a wonderful place to recuperate. A small, quiet, green town in the middle of the desert. On the one side, you could look down across El Dorado Valley to the mountains, a beautiful scene. And on the other side, you could look out across Lake Mead. You know, that beautiful blue lake in the middle of those black mountains. It was such a wonderful and restful place to recover from the war. And after the war, it went on as serving Boulder City. But then the government decided, no, we're not in the hospital business. We're going to close it down. And so when it came 1954 and the government announced you're no longer going to have a hospital, well, what are you going to do? Boulder City, you know, maybe only 25 miles from Las Vegas, but in 1954 that was still a long drive and not a very safe one, in fact. So there was a Save the Hospital campaign. The people of Boulder City got together and said, we've got to raise at least $15,000 to keep that hospital open. And if we don't, it's going to close, and what are we going to do? They went door to door with tin cans and envelopes to say, can you donate a few dollars, a few cents, anything to keep the hospital open? And Boulder City did. The people in Boulder City came together and they raised more than $15,000, and so the city took over the hospital and kept it going. Now, that's really where my personal story begins. I mean, I was born and raised here. I've written all these books about Hoover Dam and Boulder City, and I built the archive for the museum, and I've been on many, many international documentaries and always talked about Boulder City because that was my home. And part of my my part in the work, in the legacy, was to collect the history and record the history and preserve the history for the people who came after me. And so I've done that my entire adult life. But in 1954, if that door-to-door Save the Hospital campaign had failed and they hadn't raised that $15,000 and the museum had closed, then I would not have been born here. My parents would have had to go to Las Vegas or Henderson, somewhere else. And if I had not been born and raised here, what would have happened? I wouldn't have been able to do all the things I did for Boulder City. And there likely would not be a museum archive. Certainly the books I wrote would not have been written. And you look back at a time in your life at coincidences, that if this didn't happen, this wouldn't have happened. Well, this happened, so that happened. If the hospital had closed, I would not be sitting in front of you today telling these stories. So it was a successful campaign. The hospital was kept open, and I was born there just a few months later at 11:02 in the morning, Thursday, January 13th, 1955. And even though I'd gone away and come back and gone away and come back, there was always work here I needed to do. And so because people in Boulder City were so generous with their shekels in 1954, I was born here and I was able to do for the city all the things that I did. And so when that hospital went down, it was a very personal blow to me, and likely a personal blow to anybody who was born there in all of those ensuing years, and people whose parents, grandparents, brothers, sisters died in the hospital or were healed from diseases and accidents up there. You know, that's a very integral part of the city's history. And I remember 1967-68, my mother got very, very sick. And she had to go into the hospital for several very serious operations. And she was kept in what passed for intensive care in those days. And my brother and I weren't allowed to go in the hospital to visit her. So I remember our having to stand outside the old wood-framed window outside the room where she was being kept, and we could talk to her through the screen. The nurses came in and raised the old sash window, and there was an old screen, and so we could talk to my mother lying in her bed through the screen, but we weren't allowed to go in. And I don't know if my mother would have lived if she had had to go somewhere else for the care that she found here, but she did, and so that was great. The hospital served the people of Boulder City for so many years until I guess 1973, when they finally did shut it down and they opened the new hospital down on Adams Boulevard. But there were interesting stories that went on after that. The building itself, even though it was no longer a hospital, still was a very significant site. A funny story about that period. There was a prominent businessman here in town named Dick Farmer. And he built and owned that great big house just below the hospital at the bend in the road, the intersection of Avenue I and the road down to the dam. Big house. Had a big courtyard and walls. Well, he liked to sunbathe nude down there. And many times he caught the Sisters of Charity peeking at him with their binoculars until he finally had to complain to the bishop to make him stop. So that's, the history of that building went on, and cute stories, entertaining stories associated with it, And so it was always a background of my life and generations before me and a generation or two after me. And it's not just the technical history of the building. It was a place where the Kaiser Permanente programs were more or less established before they went on afterwards, because Kaiser was part of the 6 companies. And you can talk about the date that this happened, the date that happened, and something that's always there, but it has particularly personal resonance in people's lives, and it became just a background that everyone kind of took for granted. You think something will always be there until one day it's not, and then you suddenly realize that that was such an important part of my life and your life and the history of the city, and suddenly it's gone and there's a big hole there. And so, you know, when people say, where were you born? Well, I say I was born in Boulder City. Well, where? I can't say where because it's gone now. So even though, you know, my association with the hospital has been long over with, I didn't realize until it was gone just what an important role it had played in my life personally. And then when I read that it was being demolished, all those stories and all those associations came back to me, and I realized what an important part it had played and what a loss it was going to be.